Hi guys, this is session 5, the final session of the Law of Torts. Hopefully by the end of this you'll be able to complete the assignment. So yeah, as you can see here, this is the mind map we first started with in the very first session. We've covered pretty much everything now apart from these two here. Well, we did cover a little bit this last week. But as we discussed in the team session, the final part to this really does include looking at the elements as well. So you're going to be writing about the elements of law of tort and the relevant case law that has helped define those elements, and then applying it to the scenario. That's what session 5 is about. Once again, here's the assignment, and there is the deadline date, the 2nd of September. It's more than achievable. Actually it's about 7 weeks away from now if you're listening to this today on the 13th of July. So you've got plenty of time to get this done. All the resources are on Moodle on the main course page. There's also additional resources in the Law of Tort section that the law lecturer Liz has put there. So it should be pretty straightforward. As I've said before, it's just one task, nice and simple. Okay. There's the grade descriptors for those looking for merits and distinctions. Think about how you went with law of contract, reflect on some of the feedback I gave you, and read these descriptors carefully when you're finishing your work. So in session 4, we talked about the defendant Rupert, the fact that it was a criminal matter as well, and we also looked at the main claimant 1, Primrose. She has physical injury and emotional injury. It was quite a straightforward connection there between the defendant and the claimant, and it's pretty straightforward, so please look at session 4 for that. Today we're looking at the other 3. Actually, we're not going to look at George. We don't need to say much about George. He was actually with Rupert. He was drinking as well. I think the actual criminal law now says that if you are in a car with a drunk person and aware of that, then you are also liable. You are an accomplice to this crime, so you could mention that if you wanted to say something about George. But the main thing is we're going to talk about Dahlia, Jenny and Jake. Now, in order to talk about them, we're focusing on the concept of shock. Can you receive shock from witnessing or being part of an accident like the one in the scenario? So it's important to bring out some cases that have looked at this concept of claiming against shock, and there's an interesting one called McClowan versus O'Brien, which set the precedence in regards to secondary victims. Now, we've already mentioned before that the primary victim is of course Primrose, and also we mentioned in session 4 that Dahlia was also a primary victim because she was in the line of fire, if you like, and just managed to step out of the way in time before Primrose was hit, so she's regarded as a primary victim as well. The secondary victims we're talking about then are the parents, Jake and Jenny, and this case here, it set these guidelines. So for example, the person or the claimant is to be restricted to husband, wife, parent or child. We're going to be looking at this case in a little bit more detail and it'll become clearer, but because of this case, the control mechanism that was placed in regards to secondary victims was that it's restricted to your husband, your wife, or your parents, or your child. And there needs to be, once again, proximity in terms of time and space. So, for example, if something happens, it needs to be the immediate aftermath. You can't be making a nervous shock complaint, a nervous shock claim a couple of weeks later. It doesn't work that way. And the cause of shock must be through sight or hearing of the event. I'm going to emphasize the point hearing of the event because obviously we need to look at Jake's situation, and it says here through our own unaided senses. So this case was in regards to a woman who was summoned to hospital, and it was an hour after her children and husband were involved in a car crash. So notice the time element there, just an hour. Unfortunately, one child was dead and 2 were badly injured. All were in shock and had not been cleaned up. So, you can imagine the scene itself. So it'd be easy for this woman to suffer from nervous shock at the sight of your own children lying there covered in blood and injury. So the House of Law said that since the relationship was sufficiently close and the woman, although not present at the actual accident, was present at the immediate aftermath, she could claim. So the criteria for nervous shock claims by secondary victims thus became, as mentioned earlier, primary victims were restricted to husband, wife, parent, child, and the claimant must be close to the incident in terms of time and space or its immediate aftermath. And C must witness the incident with their own unaided senses. So the woman here did witness the aftermath of the incident with her own unaided senses. It was only an hour, so there's certainly time, immediate aftermath, and the primary victim here were the children and the husband, all related, obviously, all connected to this woman. So it's very easy to see, how this criteria works in regards to secondary victims. Now, another important case in relation to secondary victims relates to Alcock versus the Chief Constable of South Yorkshire. This relates to a very famous football match that ended in disaster. I believe 95 people were crushed to death. Some of you may be old enough to remember that. It was a football game, Liverpool versus Middlesbrough, and yeah, it was televised. So this is what changes. This could bring in more secondary victims, because actually, if it's televised, then millions of people are able to see this terrible incident, people dying and stuff, and therefore, can they make a claim of nervous shock? This is what we're looking at now. In this particular incident, some had identified bodies of relatives. So the camera crews had, caught bodies of relatives in mortuaries and stuff, and people sitting at home could witness this. There was an actual couple there, and they witnessed the horror firsthand in the stadium. So there was quite a lot of claims put in against the South Yorkshire Police in regards to this, and so this case set a precedence in how you would deal with secondary victims. So here's all the details here. You can look over this in more detail just by obviously pausing this video or Googling this particular case. You'll get more information on it. So what does it say here? I've already mentioned the televisedness. It was being televised. Nervous shock. So a number of claims for nervous shock were made. Most had witnessed the events on live television. Some had identified bodies of relatives in the mortuary, and a couple had witnessed the horror firsthand in the stadium. So those who had watched the event on television were not owed a duty, because this was no more shocking than information from a third party, and not the same as witnessing it with one's own unaided senses. So remember the criteria we looked at earlier. Those who identified bodies in the mortuary did some 9 hours later, and they were not owed a duty of care, because they were considered to be, or not considered to be, in the aftermath or the immediate aftermath. Okay, so that's that. And interestingly, the 2 claimants who had witnessed the crash at first hand had their claims refused, as the relationship with the victims, brother and brother-in-law, and there was insufficient evidence they had such a close and intimate relationship with the victim to give a rise to a special bond of affection, which could be automatically assumed in the case of parent, child, or husband. Okay, so you can see how this case bears out against the mechanism we talked about earlier. So the control mechanism, that is, yeah. So this control mechanism was activated here, and as you can see, most people witnessed it on television, so no more shocking than receiving information from a third party. Some of the witnesses hadn't reported this until 9 hours later, so there's no time thing there, aftermath. And the couple that had witnessed it firsthand didn't have, or insufficient evidence of a close bond. So you can see how this control mechanism works with this particular case. So just to summarise again, what criteria now for a nervous shock claim? claimant suffers nervous shock as a result of these negligent conduct. So if you now apply this to Jake and Jenny, Jenny being the parent, she was on site, she was from a distance, and she saw the aftermath and the incident happen to her daughter. So relationship to a primary victim must be sufficiently close so that reasonable foreseeable that C might suffer shock due to primary victim's injuries. You know, obviously parents, that falls under the control mechanism, so you can mention that when you know, assessing whether Jenny has a claim or Jake has a claim. And we know that in relation to Jenny, she was actually there when the incident happened. In relation to Jake, I believe he was called an hour later and received the news over the phone. So you need to assess whether there was sufficient proximity in terms of the immediate aftermath. So yeah, that's what you're going to be doing with really the last couple of paragraphs, focusing on Dahlia, Jenny and Jake in regards to whether they have a claim against the defendant for nervous shock. So I think you have all the resources now to at least produce a good assignment. As I said before, there are resources on Moodle, and of course there's a lot of resources on YouTube and you know, the internet in general about the cases I've mentioned, and also you know, anything around the nervous shock claims and things like that from other previous cases. Okay, so I hope that's everything, and best of luck in completing this in the next 7 weeks, and I look forward to marking them in September. Bye for now.